Mayer, the former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. Matt, what are you expecting to see there in Tel Aviv tonight?
Well, that's kind of the big question here, Jose, whether or not we're going to see the enormous crowds that we've been seeing over the past 2 days. Back on Sunday evening was what we saw, a huge outpouring of grief and rage against the prime minister. Of course, a lot of them angry at Hamas. They're the ones who, wielded the knife. But a lot of them were also saying that it's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as you just heard, who they believe has blood on his hands. Now, the question is whether or not the enormous amount of momentum is going to be sustained for a third day into huge additional protests tonight, and whether or not, again, there's another question. The voices outside are going to be heard in the halls of power in Jerusalem. On 2 nights previous, we've seen the protesters taking their case and some amount of violence right up to the prime minister's door in Jerusalem, right where he lives, right in his offices and areas around there. This is something that they're hoping the prime minister will hear. But these protests, they are not new. We've been seeing this kind of thing before, but it is a matter of size, and it is a matter of just expression of rage. And that's why these have been so new, because of these 6 young people who were killed over the weekend. Their bodies, such a grim discovery for the IDF. Now, we did finally hear from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu last night, as you mentioned, and he did say that he was asking for the forgiveness of these family members, but then at the same time he pivoted and turned right into almost a lecture to the Israeli public, saying that he was not going to be yielding on one of the main demands that has been a stumbling block on these negotiations, not since the beginning, but just really for the last couple of weeks. His insistence, and some of his top lieutenants, that they keep an IDF presence on what is known as the Philadelphia corridor. This is just another name for the border between the Gaza Strip, its southern border, and Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. Now, he actually had props. He brought out a map, and he was showing the Israeli public where the Philadelphia corridor is and why the IDF needs to maintain a troop presence there. He says that it's a waypoint, kind of a place where the militants from Hamas are able to bring weapons from the Sinai Peninsula into the Gaza Strip. And he says this is what has been fueling all of the violence since before October 7th. Coming out of the Gaza Strip. Now, when you talk to protesters and when you talk to family members of the hostages, they're sickened by this, and they see this as yet another roadblock standing in the way of a deal that they say could free those remaining hostages. And that's why you're hearing really strong terms like what we just heard you're playing just now, that they really do believe that, that Benjamin Netanyahu has blood on his hands. And, it doesn't help that there was this deal where before, just a couple of weeks ago, it sounded like a couple of these people, these young people who were killed, might have been released in a proposed deal in the first phase had there been a deal. And because they weren't, because Hamas and Israel weren't able to come to an agreement, they lost their lives. And so that is why a lot of these folks here say that the deaths of these 6 vindicates what they've been saying all along. The Benjamin Netanyahu strategy of pursuing the hostages and trying to get them freed through a military incursion just won't work. They say, and they have the numbers on hand, they say that the only way to free these hostages is with a negotiated peace that will bring some measure of peace to the Gaza Strip and free the remaining people. And they say that Benjamin Netanyahu, many of them cynically, believe that he's just trying to keep the war going in order to save his own political skin. Jose.
Monica, meanwhile, we've heard the president of the United States saying that Netanyahu has not done enough. Going forward, Monica, what's the president planning to do?
Well, yesterday he held a meeting in the Situation Room with Vice President Harris and with their top national security officials to discuss exact next steps on how to handle this. Remember that in the last couple of weeks, the U.S. had been trying to hurdle towards this bridging proposal that could buy more time to iron out some of the key differences that still remain between Israel and Hamas. And they felt like they were making some incremental progress there. And then now the events of this weekend and the tragic murder of those 6 hostages certainly adds some urgency to the situation. But there's this larger question now and some pressure that's growing inside the Biden administration to perhaps offer what would be known as a take it or leave it type deal, a kind of final final and best offer to the parties, which, if they were to reject, could mean the end of American-led negotiations, which have clearly been a key partner, and the U.S. has played a key role in these last few months. So is the U.S. really prepared to do that? That's an open question, but it might be one of the only final moves that the U.S. and that President Biden have left at this time. I'm told they're still discussing a range of options and that has not been decided upon necessarily. And we know that behind the scenes, there is this diplomatic push that continues that has also been a very clear pattern where we've seen top officials like the CIA director, the Secretary of State, and others traveling back and forth to the region to try to do more work with partners in Qatar and in Egypt, again, to try to work on some of these really key gaps that are the main issues that are still outstanding. But some of these are the same ones we were talking about months ago, and they remain an obstacle today. So President Biden yesterday, when he was asked whether he believes Prime Minister Netanyahu is doing enough to get to a deal, and firmly said no. They did expand on that a little bit with a U.S. official saying, of course, the president blames Hamas for the deaths of these hostages and for starting this brutal war with the October 7th attacks. But at the same time, they said the president isn't going to be shy about applying more pressure to the Israeli government to try to compromise on some of those areas like the Egypt-Gaza border or some of the other more intractable parts of this. But as we have seen, and as you just heard from Matt there, the prime minister is as dug in as ever, it appears, there in Israel. So the question now is, what can the U.S. do to change any of that? And we know that the president and the prime minister have had a fairly thorny relationship. It's been no secret that the two have had some really tense phone calls in recent months. So the question now, Jose, is whether they will get back on the phone to try to solve or work on anything else. But it was notable that the president there, which you're seeing on your screen now, when he was leaving in his second round of questions with reporters for the day, he told us that he's not negotiating with Prime Minister Netanyahu directly, that that's not how he views this. He's talking with his partners in the region and these other countries that are doing the mediating, and they're still hopeful. The president has been the one to be the eternal optimist here that something can get done. They're pushing for some movement as early as this week. Jose.
Matt and Monica, thank you both so much for being with me this morning. Avi, I want to ask you maybe a broader kind of question to begin our conversation. One of the hallmarks of a democracy is the possibility of people to protest and to, if they feel a certain way, to go out into the streets and not be threatened by that protest. And that's one of the things that we see in Israel, maybe a contrast to other countries in the region. But Avi, there's so much pain that is going around, and you see on the one hand people clearly pointing to Hamas in the streets of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, pointing at Hamas for what they just did. But then there's also massive, it seems, feelings that Netanyahu in many ways has to blame for this. How do you square that?
Well, Jose, I would say that tensions and emotions are running as high today as they ever have at any point in this war. The pain is palpable. The heartbreak is real. These 6 young people had become household names. Of course, many of us know the name of Hersh Goldberg Poland. He was an American Israeli citizen, but the 5 others were also very well known within Israel. And so the news of their murder had been met with such tremendous emotion in this country, which translated into hundreds and thousands of people pouring into the streets of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and other cities. Yes, of course, there's broad recognition that Hamas is the entity that murdered them. It's the one, of course, that took them captive in the first place, that held them under deplorable conditions, and then, of course, pulled the trigger and killed them. But there's also a lot of anger directed at the prime minister and his government for not having closed the deal earlier, not having been perhaps as forthcoming as some in the public imagined that he and his government could have been in reaching that deal. So tensions are extremely high, and as your correspondent said, it remains to be seen whether the protests continue in the next few days and what results that might have.
I'm wondering what your thoughts are. I mean, if there is another failure to reach a deal, what could this mean for the entire region going forward?
Jose, I mean, a deal, I feel like we've been talking about this for so long now, about how close negotiators come, how there may be another breakthrough. And yet what's proven to be true again and again is there's always been something standing in the way. Previously, we should be clear, the Biden administration has been very forthright to say it's been Hamas standing in the way of a deal. So this change in tone that we're hearing from the Biden administration, I think in which they're saying they don't believe that Netanyahu is doing all he can to work towards a deal, really does speak to this sense of frustration among U.S. officials that they haven't been able to get it across the finish line, that they haven't been able to negotiate another ceasefire to release additional hostages as they did several months ago, to surge aid into Gazans, to stop the killing of now, a death toll has topped 40,000 Palestinians in there. And most importantly, especially to Israel, to free those hostages. That sense of frustration is something I have heard personally from many of the hostage families I've spoken to over the last nearly 11 months. They have long felt that their prime minister, Netanyahu, was not prioritizing the release of their families, and they would acknowledge openly the political pressure he's under from the far-right members of his government to whom he is beholden and who they believe are pushing Netanyahu to continue to prosecute the war, they say, at the expense of their families' safety. And so we don't know what will happen next with a potential ceasefire deal. Anyone saying that they know, I think, is just hoping for the best. I will point out, as Monica did, that this is the president here in the United States who believes in international law, who believes in pressure from allies working towards the common goal, and who said yesterday to reporters that hope springs eternal. I think that hope is something that both Palestinians on the ground in Gaza and also everyone across Israel, most imminently these hostage families, needs to keep alive right now.
And Avi, I mean, yesterday Netanyahu responded to the growing pressure, saying that no one will preach to him. Can he keep ignoring the unrest at home and continue on this path?
Well, the prime minister
if history
has
got... Oh, I apologize, Avi. Go
sorry.
ahead.
It's all good. Look, the prime minister has resisted similar pressure in the past, most notably around the judicial reform, which his government was trying to advance just last year. The protests at the time were the same size, perhaps even larger than the ones we saw over the past few days, and he stood firm at that time, and it's certainly possible that he might do the same now. The question is whether his coalition members of his government, are able to withstand that pressure. I think that is where a lot of this rage, a lot of this activity is focused. How can you pick off certain members of his coalition to actually challenge his government and say, look, you're afraid of your government falling because of these other folks who might leave if a ceasefire is pushed through. What about if your government falls because one doesn't come through? What about the families of the hostages who are so tremendously wrought with pain and anguish at this point? When will their word be at least on the same level as those right-wing members of your coalition? And will you perhaps listen to them if they threaten your political survival? I think that's where we're at right now.
Amna Nawaz and Avi Meir, thank you both so very much. Really appreciate it. And back now to our top story this morning. Just hours ago, Russia launched one of its deadliest strikes since the war began. The toll has now risen to 49 dead, 219 others injured, according to a local Ukrainian official. Joining us now, NBC's chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, who just spoke with President Zelensky. This is Zelensky's first interview since Ukraine captured part of Russia. Richard, what more do we know, and what did the president tell you?
So this was a very unique interview. As you said, it was his first interview since Ukraine launched that surprise operation last month, captured about a 500 square mile piece of Russia. I asked him about today's Russian attack, but the larger context of the interview is very important because very little is known about Ukraine's intentions, about what it plans to do with that section of Russia that it's still holding, how long it can keep it, whether keeping it will cost Ukraine in other areas along the front lines. I can tell you just talking to people here in Kyiv, there's a great deal of excitement right now that that Ukraine was able to break the military deadlock, that President Zelensky and his military were able to flip the script instead of losing, as Ukraine has been for the last